Very common question I'm asked. What does a CEO even do? Hi everyone, I'm Jason, CEO of Make-A-Wish UK. I'm joined today by a bucket of questions that have been posed to me and a cup of tea. So I'm gonna dig into both over the next few minutes. Okay, what's the best advice you've ever been given? That's a hard one. Off the top of my head, be yourself. Okay, find out the sort of person you want to be. Try and be true to that person, or maybe the person you aspire to be, and don't try and be someone else's version of who you are. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? Well, I've already got a superpower, which is I can sleep pretty much anywhere for about 10-15 minutes, and I feel amazing afterwards. My ability to catnap under any circumstances is my existing superpower. What superpower would I like to have? Well, I'm about to do the London Marathon really slowly and really painfully, and my superpower would be to just do that in about half the time with about half the weights. How long have I been at Make-A-Wish UK? Now, some people would say too long. I disagree. I've been here just over 10 years, would you believe? So I joined straight from school, clearly. I didn't really have a plan actually for how long I was going to stay. I remember when I was interviewed, the chair at the time said, where would you like to be in 5 years' time? And I said, I'd like to be at Make-A-Wish for 5 years' time. And he told me afterwards that was the wrong answer because he felt that CEO should move on quicker than that. As long as I'm learning, as long as I'm growing, and most importantly, as long as I'm contributing for the time being, I love working at Make-A-Wish every bit as much, if not more, than the very first day I started here. What makes the charity sector so exciting at the moment? Well, things in the world are changing rapidly. The economy is moving around quite a lot, which makes leading a charity all the more exciting, all the more challenging. I quite like change. I quite like the ability to respond to change. I think the sort of pattern of there are lots of gaps in society that charities need to fill, and yet there is limited resources in which to do it, just drives a wonderful, creative, innovative, we've got no choice, we need to do things differently type of environment. And when you add to that the sort of mission of Make-A-Wish and the role that the charity sector can play in making the world a better place, for me there's no better place to be. Is working at Make-A-Wish hard emotionally? Well, I remember when I first started looking at this role, people tried to put me off and they said, you're already very emotional and you seem to cry at most things, Jason. Is this going to be the right charity for you? My mum often says to me, it must be so sad, Jason, it must be so sad. She's missing the point, I would say, because actually Make-A-Wish is a very emotional place, but the overriding emotion I get from Make-A-Wish, and I think most people do, is joy and happiness. It is a really emotional place to work. I think you need to throw yourself into it. You need to be vulnerable in the face of the mission. You need to be prepared to cry. You need to be prepared to laugh, but that most of all, you need to be prepared to share happiness with lots of other people, and that is the absolute joy of being at Make-A-Wish. What's the hardest thing about being a CEO? Okay, well, this is my first CEO role. I think you've got to recognise that you're going to be really not very good for a while. First time you do anything in life, you're not going to master it overnight. First of all, being prepared to give it a go and being prepared to fail, sometimes frequently, and then to learn from it. Beyond that, I think the hardest thing about being a CEO is, for me, the dreaded R word, which is responsibility. Because it's one thing being responsible for lots of people's employment, for making the workplace a magical place to be, but the biggest responsibility is, for me, is the children. I try and handle that responsibility carefully. So I think that for me is the hardest thing about being a CEO. How much do I earn? I've been asked this question quite a few times. Anything from more formal channels across the sector to literally men in pubs. I've even been asked the question by a chap and he said to me, do you get paid? And I said, yes. He said, I don't know how you sleep at night. How do you justify that? To which I said, for every pound I get paid, I hopefully bring in about 10. And that's the point, really. One of the first things I did when I first started the role was to say that I wanted my salary on the website. That has been the case ever since. To be really specific about it, I get paid £114,750 per year. I recognise that that is way more than the average salary. It's about return on investment, like anything else for the charity sector. Believe me, I wouldn't be comfortable with taking that sort of salary unless it was paid back multiple times for the charity. So I think it's super important that we're transparent about that. I think it's a question I'm often asked. I think it should be a basic requirement of CEOs across the sector to make sure, to proactively make sure that everybody knows that this is your salary, because if you're seeking to hide it, and what are you hiding behind? To put yourself out there to be accountable to everybody who gives to the charity and who benefits the charity, because you owe it to them. What's my go-to work snack? My go-to snack at work would be, there's some street food in a little market square in Reading, and I generally go over there, and by the time I've got back to the office I've ate it, and generally speaking I've got some of that food down my top. What would be my dream musical? I love musicals, okay? Anything from opera through to the ballet, through to, sort of more, mainstream pop concerts. I also love a romance. My favourite musical would be West Side Story, because it is obviously the modern version of Romeo and Juliet. There is so much beauty in the music, and both from a sort of film point of view, but also more importantly from a live performance point of view. Floods of tears, love West Side Story. Okay, are there any wishes that have stuck with me during my time at Make-A-Wish UK? Now, one of the wonderful things about what I do is I do, not as much as I'd like to, but I do get to meet children and families, and sometimes I can be part of wishes and sometimes I can be part of wish discoveries. There's lots actually that spring to mind. The one I would probably point to would be George's wish to go tobogganing. George had Batten's disease. By the time I'd met him and his mum Claire, his condition was terminal. He was about 5 years old and he'd lost the power of speech. However, he had a form of communication with his mum that most people who can speak in more traditional ways would be envious of, because they had a wonderful connection. And one of the things on what Claire called his bucket and spade list was to go tobogganing down a mountain, which he subsequently did in Austria. And halfway down that mountain, he spoke to his mum for the first time in 18 months. And that just embodies the power of a wish, that memory that would never have been possible otherwise. George is no longer with us, but he would have had that memory for the rest of his life, and I know that she'll have that for the rest of hers, and it will also be in my memory for the rest of my life. What would your wish have been when you were 10? Now, this was obviously just after the Second World War, so we're going back a long way. But I was an Aston Villa fan, and there was a long-haired, very 70s looking footballer called Brian Little, who was my hero, and my wish would have been to have met him. And weirdly, I did. So about 8 years later, I was presented with an award for being a reasonably average goalkeeper at the time, and lo and behold, it was Brian Little that awarded me that prize, and it was a wonderful moment to meet the amazing Mr. Little. What does a CEO even do? Lots of things. The why is easy, because that's the mission, but it's a lot of what I do is about what we are going to achieve and how we can achieve it, right? So the what would be, how are we going to measure success over the long, medium, short term? How do we make sure we've got a really clear vision of success? How do we make sure everybody's pointing in the same direction in order to make that happen? How do we make sure we've got the capabilities within the organisation, whether it be people or technology, to make all that happen? But I think the most important thing that the CEO does is to lead and hopefully to inspire, and that should not be difficult really with the mission that we've got. So to be inspired by the mission, but then to pass that inspiration on to employees, volunteers, supporters, so that we have got the resources that we need to ultimately reach our vision of granting the wish of every eligible child. Day to day, what that looks like is, so I might be having a meeting, like for instance I had a meeting this morning with the senior leadership team, and we are making decisions about what the planning process is going to look like. So that's stuff like, how do we make sure that we're investing in the right areas? How do we ensure that we've got reserves at an appropriate level? Where do we need to prioritise resources? Things like that. So there's a day-to-day that might be quite a lot of that sort of leadership decision making to be had. I will also be meeting external supporters quite a lot. So I guess most of our bigger supporters I would have some form of relationship with. And then there's stuff like one-to-ones with direct team members, making sure that everybody's clear about their objectives, on supporting people's development, and then some of the wider communication into the organisations as a whole and externally through stuff such as this. Okay, if I was to do any other role at Make-A-Wish, what would I choose? It would be, and you're probably going to guess this, it would be a wish granter, because it's a massively challenging role. It's the front line, one of the front lines anyway of the organisation, certainly the front line into children and their families. So there are lots of challenges that come with that, but it is also the role which is closest to the magic of the wishes. I love the imagination of children. I love our ability to embrace that, to stimulate that, to make that into a reality. And that is at the heart of what wish granters do. So whether or not I'll be any good at it is another matter, but if I was to choose one role, it would be to be a wish granter. What is the biggest misperception about the work that you do? I'm taking that as we do, as in Make-A-Wish. So the biggest misperception is that Make-A-Wish is this lovely fluffy thing over there where there's lots of happy things going on, but really what it amounts to is a nice thing rather than a necessity, an essential thing. And it completely misses the whole point of what we do, which is that we create magical memories that last a lifetime. We improve the emotional well-being of children at the darkest times of their lives. We strengthen relationships across families that lead to better outcomes for everybody. And those things are not as well known as I'd like them to be. I think if people understood the lasting impact of wishes, then we would in turn be reaching more children because more people would be supporting us. Next one. Why do I think that wishes are important? We need to be granted about 10,000 wishes a year in order to reach every child that's got critical illness. But that only tells part of the story. I think probably the best way of me answering that is if I think about my own children, right? So if I was given the news that one of them had such a condition, I can't imagine anything more devastating. What I know about wishes, what I've learned about wishes over the last 10 years, is that in the face of that, even if that news is about a terminal condition for a child and that child is going to die at a premature age, wishes can bring memories, that they can bring joy, that they can bring comfort, and they can celebrate love during the time that child has, however long that time happens to be. And I know if I was that parent, I would need that. I would benefit from that I could take something positive from the passing of my child in circumstances that would otherwise just purely be dark. Wishes accompany those emotions, that don't take those emotions away. And so they leave parents, irrespective of the outcome for their child, with wonderful memories. There are obviously thousands of children whose wishes were granted who, God willing, go on to live healthy and happy lives. And having met many of those children who have since become young people, I know that 10, 20, however many years later, they are still drawing upon those memories. They are still drawing upon that experience. Those memories have lasted with them across decades. And ultimately, there is nothing more important in any of our lives that we take away than memories, in particular memories of times with loved ones. And that for me is why wishes are so important. What drives me? Okay, but the biggest single thing that drives me in this role is the thought of those children whose wishes that we're not granting. Okay, we talk a lot about the wishes that we grant, but we know that there are thousands of children who are diagnosed every year who aren't being granted a wish. Irrespective of what the rest of their lives are going to look like, the missed opportunity for them and their families that a wish would have otherwise fulfilled is what drives me. It's what will always drive me in this role, because there needs to be a world one day where that doesn't happen. What is the best thing about my job? The best thing about my job is meeting children and their families and playing a small part, whether that be doing a wish discovery or whether that be being on a wish, or whether that would just be having a conversation with them about their wish, because that just reinforces to me the difference that we're making. One of the things about Make-A-Wish is it is so tangible. The difference we make is visible, and it's this person and it's that person, and it just inspires me to meet those people. And as part of that, I love the imagination of children, and I try and learn from children as much as possible, because I don't want to become that person that is cynical or doesn't think things are possible. Children remind you that things are possible, and wishes are a wonderful example of that. Okay, what sort of skills and experience do you need to be a CEO? It's a leadership role, right? So whatever else your specialist skills are, you need to have leadership skills. What does that actually mean? It means that you are able to inspire people towards a mission. You're able to emotionally connect with that mission, and in turn connect a whole organization and a whole disparate network of people to that same mission. There is practical stuff in there around you need to be able to work with and manage boards. You need to be able to build teams. You certainly need to be able to provide leadership on strategy. You need to also understand what your you're good at and what you're not good at. In other words, you need to have a level of self-awareness because you're not going to be good at everything. And trying to be good at everything is a recipe for disaster, believe me. So building skills around you that can compensate for, in my case, my many weaknesses, and through that, building an organisation that's capable of achieving its mission is at the heart of what it means to be a CEO, and that's the sort of skills and experience that you need. Okay, what is my favourite ice cream flavour? Okay, at this point I need to make a disclosure. I don't like ice cream. Not only do I not like ice cream, I don't like chocolate. The number of times I have confessed this and been met with he's a bit of a weirdo sort of look, I've lost count of. I almost wish I did like ice cream, but I don't, so I can't give you what my favourite flavour is. Ooh, what is on my playlist right now? I love music. I'm in a band. I'm a bad singer in an otherwise good band, and I love learning about music. So my playlist is so varied. But most recently, I do like George Harrison. One of my favourite songs of George Harrison is a song called Something, and there's a version by Shirley Bassey, which is just amazing. I love singing where you can feel the power of someone's emotion, and she's got one of those banging voices where it just absolutely grabs you. I'm a big Elvis fan for the same reason. Currently, on my playlist, Shirley Bassey singing Something, give it a go. What do I like to do outside of work? I like sport. I play or try to play golf. I like to watch football. I'm an Aston Villa supporter. I love spending time with my children. I've got 2 children and I love being with them. I like eating too much, the occasional glass of wine. Yeah, those are the sorts of things I like doing outside of work.